Hello. Today we're going to be speaking about virtual communities and how to create community during a pandemic. I admit this is more about virtual communities. When we meet in class, we're going to talk more about creating community during the pandemic, but they're very much interrelated. Obviously, since during the pandemic we've had to be social distancing, and an option is virtual communities. But of course, there's other options because you can still have, um, community with each other as long as you're social distancing. This lecture is extracted from quite a few sources. I should probably list some others. This is a new topic for me, so I've really only started thinking about it and exploring it because of this course and the pandemic. So you'll see that I am reading more from my slides, and I can see this lecture will evolve. It is just draft one. So, what is a virtual community? Now, you notice this is from 1993. Internet was more widely available then. And it's social aggregators that emerge from the net. That's what we used to call it, to be cool back then in the 90s. When enough people carry on those public discussions long enough with sufficient human feeling to form webs of personal relationships in cyberspace. So the key terms is obviously it is something that is through the internet, on the web, virtual, but it is also about still personal relationships. People who have studied virtual communities, and I have to admit it's more of a newer field, and when I was doing a research for this, I found a lot of the research has been done more in, computer, the computer field, or in business or other areas. There wasn't quite as much related to community development in itself. But generally, from what I've learned, that there are really most virtual communities are categorized into four types: communities of interest, goal-oriented community of interest, learners community, and communities of practice. And you'll see that in some cases, these sort of overlap. So we're going to go through and discuss what each of these types of virtual communities are. So when I was reading, I found some people called it community of interest. Some people said another category was goal-oriented, and yet another category of these types of communities was called a social online community. So really, they're all sort of the same, a community of interest. Sometimes it might be a little more goal-oriented, and it could also be social. So there's information exchange in these communities usually about a specific topic. There's sharing of diverse perspectives, and depending on whatever the mandate is, of the group. They're usually formed by members of various different backgrounds, and they come together under some sort of common goal or common interest. But it also, around that interest or goal, it provides an environment for socializing, which could be unrelated to the topic. And these communities can be loosely formed and temporary, or could be long-lasting. So examples, obviously Facebook is the most common, but I would say that's more of a social one. But obviously it could be a special interest groups that are on Facebook. For example, I belong to one on community gardens of Newfoundland and Labrador. Another one is on Newfoundland, homesteading. And again, these are forums where people, share information, etc. People post pictures of plants and say, like, what plant is this? Or how do I get rid of, this type of weed, that sort of thing. They can also be hobby websites or forums. For example, one that I've sort of recently got involved in is Ants Canada. And my son is interested in ants. So, there's sharing of information. For example, is trying to he wants to capture a queen ant and create an ant colony. So we can take pictures and then post them on the forum, and people will help identify the ant or, give us advice. And often there could be social advocacy groups can also be a part of these communities of interest or goals. We're going to talk about those a little bit later as a special group. And support groups are also very common, helping people with specific conditions. So I could do a whole topic on online gaming, but I've mentioned to you before that I play the game Forge of Empires and now belong to on this online gaming community. You'll see there I am, Adu the Impaler. And, there are 20 of us, and I've belonged to this guild now for almost 4 years. Obviously, it's mostly about playing the game, but there's also sharing of information and support. For example, during COVID, I noticed there wasn't as much chatter, but people were checking on each other sometimes, if they didn't see someone playing for a few days. Sharing of information about what's going on about COVID across the world. Everyone's from different countries. Sometimes it's, seeking advice about things like, people were asking, oh, what do we do about Halloween during COVID? And a lot of us are parents. So it was like sharing parenting information about, how to make Halloween fun without trick-or-treating. And so oddly, I feel quite connected to these people. I don't know who they are. I don't know their first names. I just know their game name and, their avatar faces. But I would still view them as a part of my friends and my community. Just want to talk about Facebook in particular and any social media. I guess I could have put Twitter and these other things. There's so many tools to support virtual communities, and we might talk about that more in class. It really takes time to develop these networks, though, and when you establish these larger networks, it's really important that you're keeping in touch regularly. So, as we'll talk about in a bit, there's really a difference between just using technology as a communication versus a virtual community. So, it can really help people, though, form a community over a topic of interest. And you can even say when you're using Facebook, you can say, this group is based on the concept of communities of interest, and that Facebook helps to support these types of communities and other types of social media platforms, YouTube, etc. Next is a learners community, which you're probably a little more familiar with. This is the participation of a collective educational project. It's supposed to provide learning opportunities and also for the learners to contribute to others' learning. Usually, there's obviously someone who's sort of in charge, the main administrator, and you have to do like hosting, support, and perhaps moderating. And this could be long-term, like a degree or a profession, or a short-term, like a course. So obviously, Brightspace, D12, WebCT, all these Google Classroom, all these platforms are for learning communities, and webinars and that sort of thing. So the image on the left is showing it's WebCT, but it's very similar to Brightspace, providing a discussions where people are able to post and share amongst a class. Then here's a learning community, I guess, that I belong to. It's called Dat exchange, very geeky, but anyway, it's for researchers like myself who are interested in social science statistics, and there's posting and sharing of information. People answer questions. Another one, which I guess is sort of related to more of a professional community, but there's also things nowadays like conferences and things that you can attend. For example, this year, Parks and Recreation Ontario held, a virtual education forum that ran, for several months, and then there was also like discussion pages. So it was an example of a learning community for recreation and parks professionals. But when it comes, learning communities and communities of practice are somewhat related. Communities of practice are for professionals, and I guess learning communities are for students more. But the communities of practice that I belong to, it's also very much about learning. But a community of practice is about professionals. So professional practice development through sharing of knowledge among members of a specific professional community. So be it, teachers, community recreation professionals, therapeutic rec, lawyers, I could go on and on, but very specific to a specific community. So obviously there's 3 characteristics. They have a shared domain of interest, or I would say career path, usually. There's engagement in joint activities to share information and to learn. People share resources. And it's, really it's about making a repertoire of resources for practice so that people don't have to reinvent the wheel, and they can, learn from others and, share materials that they've developed. For example, in physical education, there are, and pardon me, I see a typo on this slide. It shouldn't have been online courses, remote course webinars. It should have been mostly it's websites that are communities of practice. But for example, in physical education, I learned from a student years ago, master's student, who was also a phys ed teacher. And, he said, there's all these online things. You just, for instructors, you go online. There's these communities where people share all their curriculum and, resources that they've developed. And so you can go in and, quickly find things last minute or post things. So it's, physical educators sharing all resources. We used to have something kind of like this for recreation. It was called Lynn. It was super awesome, but it has been taken down, and I'm not sure if it's sort of being replaced, but I'm not sure. And then another example here is the Canadian Association for University Continuing Education. You see here that, so these would be like, I guess, like instructors, administrators, like for example at Memorial, who deal with professional education, continuing education for professionals. So you can see they have created these communities of practice so that people from across Canada can go into these communities. There's a leader, and it's around people of special interest. So some people are interested, for example, how to further develop continuing education in leadership and program management. Another one is about online learning and instructional design. Another one is Indigenous and decolonization programming. Like for example, there's obviously a big movement now to be including a lot more Indigenous curriculum in all of our courses. And lastly, the Academy of Leisure Sciences. This is a community I belong to as a community of practice, and it is, for researchers and educators in recreation and leisure. And, people post, for example, someone might post a list of videos that they have watched in this on a certain topic they use in their courses. Or I could ask, hey, I'm teaching community development. Does anyone have resources on creating community during pandemic? and I would have gotten responses. I did not do that, but. So a few specific types of virtual communities, which I think are often, these are probably all more what I would call a common interest or goal-oriented or social sort of ones. So there's self-help communities or support group communities, communities for advocacy, and project communities. I should point out one that I left off here is which I actually see the question mark. I'm not sure why my question mark is still there, but it's called an e-commerce community. So I'm things like Kijiji, eBay, all these types of communities where it's really about buying and selling of things. So, those companies basically are trying to create a sense of community, but it's so that people will buy things. Or sell products. So, that's another type, but I didn't think it was really that relevant. It is relevant to community development, I guess, and it's important actually, now that I think about it, in COVID, how to keep businesses going. But anyway, I decided not to discuss it in this lecture. So self-help communities are obviously online communities that enable people to share experiences and relate to others' problems wherever they are. Pardon me, should be and, not ant, and no matter where they are. For example, when it comes to disabilities, there are many, many types of, online communities for people. So one example is the Spina Bifida Association. Might be difficult to see on here. I took it from another presentation, but in this you can see they have an online support network. So this is, they've got rules and regulations, they've got general discussion news, they have all these little, topics. Then look over to the right, there's a section for kids, anyone who wants general questions or wants to learn about wheelchair sports or hobbies. There's a group for teens, for adults, for friends, for parents and teachers and family, etc. Looks pretty amazing. And there's tons. Another one I've seen before. I tried to look it up, but I can't remember the name exactly. And unfortunately, a movie has a similar name. But I thought it was called Like Me or Three Like Me or something. And anyway, it's an online community for worldwide for people with more rare disabilities that aren't as common. I've seen some, for chronic pain, which I have looked at, interested as a researcher, but also as an individual, many types of communities. Then there's also communities for advocacy. So, and these are used quite often. These are online communities formed around a social or environmental issue. And, for example, it could be around accessibility in St. John's, or it could be around food security, or, any kind of big topic. But usually there's a mandate then to advocate and create change. Obviously, a global example of this is Amnesty International. It used to be more of a physical presence, but, even for a long time, they've been doing everything, virtually, and creating a virtual community, really, around, issues of human rights. Here's another example. There might be, this is an advocacy group that is trying to get, it's about Down syndrome research. So it's to advocate for Down syndrome research, but also to provide parents with current and, up-to-date information on Down syndrome. And specifically to say, like, we need more research on understanding this. And lastly, which I don't have an example really, is a project community. So obviously it's a community that is online, virtual, created for a short-term time, around a project, and then it's usually disbanded. It was difficult for me to find specific examples, but for example, there could be I don't know, for example, for the Commonwealth Games, there would have been in Newfoundland, there would have been maybe a project group, a website or a forum or, Twitter feed all about that. You can see this, marketing does this all the time. They create a whole website for just a specific product and then disband it, after people are aware of it. So this could be, creating a park, a community park, and there's like information for it. Or another example, I didn't see exactly a virtual community, but for example, I saw in St. John's there's been a lot of parts of websites devoted to things like the accessibility around Rawlings Cross or biking issues in St. John's. So again, a specific community project. You create a community and then it's sort of done with. So the big question then is, are virtual communities really and truly communities? There's a lot of debate in the literature. Some people say yes. For this quote here, when the excitement of a community tie wears off, I'm sorry, this should have been, no, I have these the wrong way. I apologize. So the no is, when the excitement of a common tie wears off, users realize virtual communities offer thin communion without additional geographic or physical linkages. So saying that, what they're saying here is that no, it is not a virtual community, a real community, because it's just too thin. But the yes side, again, I apologize for mixing the sides up. The virtual community does not include identification with place, but it does require common ties and social interaction. But it might be more likely that it's more narrow communication around a specific topic. So a lot of research is saying, yes, virtual communities are real communities, but, it is narrowly based. I found this quote, and it was in 1993, but, it really shows that perhaps it is. Virtual communities are communities. People in virtual communities use words on screens to exchange pleasantries and argue, engage in intellectual discourse, conduct commerce, exchange knowledge, share emotional support, make plans, brainstorm, gossip, feud, fall in love, find friends and lose them, play games, flirt, create a little high art, and a lot of idle talk. People in virtual communities do not do just about everything that people do in real life, but we leave our bodies behind. You can't kiss anybody and nobody can punch you on the nose, but a lot can happen with those boundaries. To the millions who have been drawn into it, the richness and vitality of computer-linked cultures is attractive, even addictive. So, that's true. I think when I really think about it, I think that virtual communities can provide much of what face-to-face communities can do. However, in the end, as it said in the second, there isn't physical contact. And that's always been something I struggle with, is like, for example, I might be connected with my Forge of Empire friends, but in the end, I don't know their name. They're not going to come over and help me if I'm in the hospital and my kids need help. They're not providing tangible support. So some people have looked at, what happens in these virtual communities. Well, the outcomes then is that virtual communities can, in a way, reduce community itself. People are spending time in a solitary activity, searching and browsing, etc. And it is, now what I would argue here is that are they really, they're not really maybe engaged in a virtual community. I think that it's very difficult here to distinguish what's the what's a virtual community versus just like using technology. But obviously, there's a lot of research to show, obviously, that as technology and screen time and internet use have increased, sense of community has gone down. And some people argue then it creates a weak replacement for community, that users participate in communities defined only by their interests or topics, so meaning it's narrow. But I guess my argument is, I think that, so what? Maybe it's the only way for them to actually fully engage in a community. So, but I would agree that as long you still want, ideally, that people are engaged in face-to-face communities. Virtual communities obviously also reinforce communities. They do, online communities and communication allows communities to form, and it also allows communities to be maintained. So I just want here to distinguish between a virtual community versus using technology. Obviously, a virtual community is only online. It is about being a community of interest, goal, a learning, etc. It is not a supplemental community. It's only online, no face-to-face. That is the real definition of a virtual community. In contrast, we have online technology where you could have, Facebook, social media, YouTube, and all this is being used to support existing communities. So just make sure to distinguish that. We have virtual communities, and then we might just be using online, technology to help us with a community. But right now, during COVID, I'm not sure about this distinction. Are they really different? Right now, online technology is being used to replace social interaction due to the pandemic. And therefore, it's creating virtual communities. And those virtual communities are then creating more online technology. Anyway, so it goes around. And I think right now, then it's very difficult to distinguish this. When is it a virtual community, and when is it just the online technology use? But an interesting thing to think about, and also one, I guess, to emphasize that, maybe this is really just a gray area. And, when is it just technology? When does online technology become a community? So online or virtual communities provide alternatives. And that's maybe a better way to look at it. Personally, as a social scientist, I think human interaction is very important. I also know that we can't be on screens all the time. So, I'm definitely a proponent of better to have real, face-to-face communities. But I'm not saying that online communities don't have their place, and they're certainly important when there's no alternatives. Communities, as we know, we've talked about, are becoming more fragmented. Geographic space, we're losing cohesion due to cultural and economic globalization. So online communities provide an alternative, an antidote to social alienation and placeness experienced in geographic communities. You can see that you're able to often be social with your online communities whenever you want, so it's easier. There's also new forms of communities based on our interest and affinity rather than location. So we might have more in common with these communities, online communities of interest, than we do, with the people who are geographically around us. So people are adapting to the internet and social media then to fit their networked life, holding strands of connections and making and breaking new ones as needed. It is, I think this point is saying that, sometimes online communities lead to in-person communities. But we have to remember, often in online communities, the dialogue is specific to few and yet read by a larger unknown set of participants who may or may not be considered community members. The conversations are also less inhibited, non-conforming, and relatively free of personal consequences. You can say what you want, especially if it's anonymous. It's much easier. And as I've said before, though, online friends cannot provide tangible support. They can provide emotional support, informational support, but, a friend cannot come over, an online friend cannot come over and, bring you chicken soup when you're sick, or drive you to the hospital for your treatments, as examples, or hug you. We also have to consider the types of behaviors in online communities, because just with any community, there can be problems with online communities, but especially because of the lack of consequences or anonymity of online, it's much easier to have negative behaviors. So some researchers have looked at types of behavior online. And one is lurkers. And I should have really put it not as number one, but as number two. Anyway, lurkers are neutral behavior. So these are the invisible participants in the community that read what others have written without also writing themselves. And they don't really contribute to significant information gathering. I would say, for example, my husband is a lurker on Facebook. He reads it, scrolls through it every day, sees what everyone's doing, probably never likes or interacts even, probably never comments, maybe unless it's a birthday. So, he's just lurking around. We can also have hostile behaviors in online communities as well, though, luckily, as positive or interactive behaviors. So people have been researching the hostile or negative behaviors that happen online. Obviously, and these are the types that they're called. So flaming. Flaming is like argumentative posts written purely for the sake of insulting others, saying like you're wrong or whatever. There is trolling. So these are posts seeking to elicit flames, are called flame bait. So, obviously, it's just trying to get people riled up, just to be like a bully and mean. Spamming. Pardon me, I had a vacuuming interruption. Anyway, I believe I was talking about spamming. These are posts regarding unsolicited junk mail. So, just think of, all the zillions of emails, offers, etc. that you get. And it doesn't have to be about commerce. It can be about information as well. And then, as this researcher called it, cyber rape. So posts of unsolicited, unwelcome, and that are assaultive in nature. And this can be, not just about name calling, but, threatening terrible things. And I don't know if I've heard many stories online, in podcasts and stuff I've listened to, but some of the terrible things that have happened to people, online, to the point of, people posting their address and them, not feeling safe, and, wrecking careers, and obviously can be extremely psychological. So those are obviously hostile ones, and therefore it's important, if we're developing online communities, we have to be regulators of these things. So making sure that there are rules and regulations for online behavior in order to reduce these types of behaviors. But obviously, online communities can have positive interaction. Obviously, this might just be announcements, like sharing news and information. There could be queries for specific requests of information, queries by other community members, or queries from others. So, a lot of, specific information that people want to know. And there can also be group projects. So, a specific goal of that community, or, a database project, or a film there's just tons of things that could be happening. So these are obviously interactive, meaning that there's sharing of information and resources. So there are strategies to increase sense of community among online communities, and how to this researcher called them affordances, but that really just means like supports, or how do we get online communities to have even greater sense of community. And these researchers talked about persistence first. It's continuous over time and used by many. So it's usually not a small group, but it's a large online group. And often some of these communities can be going on for years and years. Periodicity, so that's like how often things happen. So the sense of time and rhythm to the interactions. So this is a very silly example, but I'm thinking of YouTube as a community. And my sons, watch and like and all that, a lot of Minecraft YouTubers. So I'm not saying that that's really an online community, but in a way. But my sons know that on Monday, that Pixel Riffs is going to post this part of one of his projects, and then on Tuesday it's a different thing. They've got like a schedule of the information sharing. So this often happens in online communities too, knowing when certain things are going to be made available. There's often boundaries or areas, so there could be multi-use areas where everyone is engaging, having specific chat rooms or forums, and private areas as well is often part of an online community, or helps online communities. And a lot of engagement, and that means multiple ways to connect and interact. So that might be posting, that might be blogs, it might be announcements, it might be forums, just multiple ways in which people can connect and communicate. And then authoring. So users create content in space and recreate it as well. So, for where the users are able to have provide information themselves. So either resource sharing or writing sections. So it's interactive where everyone is contributing. So that's what I have for today's discussion, really on virtual communities. And we'll springboard from this to really think about creating community during pandemic, whether it's, through these online technologies and virtual communities, and or, how to just create sense of community in a geographic area with social distancing.